Okay, we are going to be looking at the question of, is it illegal to own a car if you're homeless? And okay, so this is a prominent question on the internet because obviously there's a homeless crisis in the US, but it depends on how you define home. And so I looked into whether you could use a campground because a lot of people consider their car, their van, or their RV as their permanent residence, which would be the equivalent of their home. In my case, I own land, but I want to use the land as a campsite. So we're just going to go through this. I've found it very fascinating, and I do have an answer, what I think is the answer, but I'm going to save it till the end here because I went through a lot of different side roads, so to speak, to get to this answer. So the first person says, these are just various comments I posted. If it's an address. Now there's a difference between the real ID driver's license and the non-federal compliant driver's license. So in my state, they still allow you to have a non-federally compliant driver's license, which is what I would be doing. In that case, you do not need to verify your address if you do a change of address. But you do need to be able to get your mail sent there. On the other hand, you can have a mailing address that's different than your residential address. And so the key is that if you have your mail sent somewhere else, can you have a residential address that does not have a mailbox? So in this case, a person's saying, well, you get your mail sent there, and then you take your mail to the DMV to prove that that's your address. Again, you don't have to prove that's your address if it's not a real ID. On the other hand, if it's a business address, well, you can use a PO box, but the DMV won't accept anything with a PO box. So the other question is, well, okay, let's say you get your driver's license, but what about your bank account? Could you have a bank account if you're using a mail virtual mailbox, which has a street address, but it's not a PO box? And what was fascinating about this is there's somebody online who's advocating, homesteading off grid, and sure enough, they use a personal mailbox or a private mailbox. And I said, well, if that's not a residential street address, then it gets flagged as a commercial address based on the zoning. And he said, well, it's a mom and pop business, so I don't have any problem. So I don't know. Maybe just because he lives in a small town that they don't care about the zoning or something. Okay, so one of the options is you could go to a homeless shelter and ask to use their address, but then that would mean you'd have to pick up the driver's license at the homeless shelter, and you have to fill out some card, and then basically your name is included with all the other homeless people at that address, so that would affect your credit score, most likely. So that'd be a big pain, because then you'd be trying to get all your mail at the homeless shelter, so you don't really want to do that if you can avoid it, obviously. Okay, so again, if you want a bank account, then they have to have a a place where they can mail a credit card and has to be a street address by law. Okay, now this is kind of interesting because if you look into the actual law, um, the okay, this is another thing here is a PO box. You cannot send any what do they call it? Any registered mail to a PO box. So that would be legal mail. Okay, so based on as I said, based on the financial law to prevent money laundering, you can have a business address, and also your tax statements can be mailed to a business address. Which would be like a commercial street address, not a PO box. Okay, so here again, if you're trying to get a driver's license, you can use a temporary mailing address, and so you could actually use general delivery, which would only last for 30 days. And you can only do that once. In other words, they're assuming that when you do put a different mailing address for the driver's license, they're assuming that that's a temporary mailing address and not your actual residential address. And that's why they say that you have to be able to receive mail at your residential address, even though your driver's license might not be sent to that address. Okay. All right, so then they'll tell you, let me get into this. In order to prove, this is for the real ID, that you'd have to have your mailing address be the same in the property description for the real ID, the federal driver's license, federally compliant driver's license. So your property statement would have to be the same address as your mailing address. Okay, so here we have, I'm not sure where I got this. This looks like it's an AI thing, AI response. Some of these I've posted AI responses. But the driver's license checks for a residential street address, not a mailing street address. So, in other words, if you're allowed to give a mailing street address option, but what they're verifying is that you also provide a residential street address as your permanent address. Now, keep in mind that does not mean you can accept. It doesn't mean you have a mailbox at your residential street address. In fact, the DMV provides an option that does not include that. So that's the interesting difference that I want to accentuate here. So okay, so assuming you're not getting the federally compliant real ID, then you don't have to do this whole proof of residency here. And if you already have a driver's license from that state, then you've already proved your residency. So that's why they don't require it if you're just changing your address. Okay, so we'll get past, this is all proof of residency. Okay, so here's a person who they were not able to use their campground address for their bank account to set up a bank account because that goes against the federal banking. Again, that's the money laundering for FINRA, and I'm going to go into that. But obviously, they're pointing out you would need a commercial address or a residential address for your bank account, according to FINRA, but probably depends on the bank. like the banker has some discretion, obviously, for that. Okay, so here's somebody saying you could use a vacant lot for your if it's assigned a street address by the local government. Um, and then you can install a mailbox. But you can't use a vacant lot for mail delivery if you don't go through that process. Okay, that's obviously obvious. So here we have the issue of what to get a driver's license. If you look at the actual statute of the driver's license, it says that it's based on a change in your permanent domicile. That's what the actual statute says, is that a change in your permanent domicile. Now, what's interesting about that is that your domicile is associated with your residential address, and your residential address is the main way that you prove your domicile, because it's where you get your legal documents mailed to as a residential address. But the domicile is not necessarily your residential mailing address. So this is where you get into the whole thing where people living in an RV are setting up domicile in a RV friendly state, which would be Florida or Texas or South Dakota. And there's a few others, I guess, like Nevada, Montana, and Oregon. So you have all these businesses that they actually provide you that service where you register your vehicle and get your driver's license, and then the first thing you have to do is you set up your domicile residential address, or you set up your domicile address, but again, that's not the same as your residential address because you're going to be driving around the country. So it gets complicated because if your state where you have a residence challenges your domicile, then you can get in trouble because you have to formally change your tax status with the state. You have to revoke your domicile status, and this is kind of interesting. So there's an assumption that your domicile does not change even if you change your residency somewhere else. If you move out of the state, you get a job somewhere else. It does not mean that your state domicile status has changed. And so this is where you get an interesting, like for example, they're saying if you try to use your new domicile address for your bank, the bank might refuse it because they're saying it'll come up as a mail forwarding address and not a residency, because they know that you're not living there. So here you have this overlap between a domicile versus a residency. So yeah, it's complicated where there's basically a database of these mail forwarding services that they know are not where people are living because they're getting their mail forwarded. So it might be your domicile, but it's not your residency, and so the bank's gonna not allow it. On the other hand, you could have a commercial street address that would be part of your residency because it's where you do your business. And so, okay, so then you get into the problem where you're supposed to renew your driver's license every 30 days. But the question is, if you actually read the statute, what it says is if your permanent address changes, then you have 30 days to to provide your different permanent address. So it's not, people misunderstand this statute because they think that if you're moving every 30 days, then you have to change your address 30 days. No, that's not true. What it what it means is that if you have a new permanent address. Now, what they say is that if you have a lease, then that's your new permanent address. No, that's not true either. But the DMV workers, they might not understand this subtlety. So I did a video before on the 6 month shuffle for the RV park. So that proves that if you stay in a place for more than 6 months, like 6 months in a day, then that becomes your primary residence. Is a primary residence the same thing as a permanent residence? No, it's not quite the same thing, because a permanent residence is where you intend to live permanently. And so they use like 7 to 9 months to establish the permanent residence. So the actual, like the post office has a permanent address change, and then they also have a temporary address change. So, for example, if you get a PO box, you have to renew it every year, and that's considered. And if you get a temporary address change, you have to renew it after a year, but you can only renew it for another 6 months, and you have to renew it after 6 months. So that proves again that 6 months limit is the difference between a temporary and a permanent address change. So most of these campgrounds, to use a campground address, they explicitly state that you cannot use it for a permanent residence, and this includes even the county government. Like if you rent a county cabin, they say explicitly you cannot use it as a permanent residence address, and that's so that again is the 6 months in a rule thing. It's a very slight difference between what's a primary residence versus a permanent. So permanent is your domicile. So the domicile is where you intend to stay. Now, if you don't have a residence there, then that shows that it's probably not your domicile, even though you've registered a domicile address there. In other words, like these RV friendly states, they'll recognize it as a domicile, but you have to prove to the state that you left that you've ended your domicile there. And if you haven't proved that you ended your domicile there, then they're going to still claim that you still are domiciled there. So that's the whole problem with these whole domicile RV businesses, that if you're at a state that can challenge that, then you lost your domicile, and then you can lose your driver's license for that. You have to reestablish where your permanent residence is for your driver's license. Okay, so once you do set up your bank account, you can change to have a different mailing address, because of setting up a bank account is where they use the computer system. And they also use a fishing license or a hunting license, because you're having that mailed to a street address. And you need a driver's license to get the fishing license or hunting license, even though the mailing address might be different than your driver's license address. So that's kind of an interesting difference, because you can use your fishing or hunting license to establish domicile, even though you're having it mailed to a different address than is on your previous driver's license address. Now, again, that might not be where you're actually living, because you could have it mailed to a virtual street address, a virtual mail box that's at a street address. Okay, so Yeah, so if you have a passport, then you don't need the real ID federally compliant driver's license because you can use your passport to get on flights and all that, which is what I would be doing. Um, okay, so um, and then if you want to use a post office box, they have this thing where you can get a street address, but apparently the driver's license computer base will they'll check the difference between that, so that wouldn't work either. But it depends again because it could be that the DMV worker might not check it. In other words, if you have if you use the street address of your post office, that that might be allowed, but it depends on whether they check it or not. So what happened is that people get um, they'll get a virtual mail address like a UPS store, and then it ends up getting flagged in the DMV computer system after like several years, and then they get it's not allowed anymore. So here's an interesting example where he had to bring copies of his property deed papers and satellite photos and pinpoint where he lived in order to allow that on his driver's license. And then they created a driver's license. And that's after the real ID. So, so this is where they allow this option where this person did not have a street address, so the DMV allowed him to use a PO box, but because of the Real ID Act, he was no longer allowed to use a PO box, so then he had to prove where he lived with the property deed. So this is essentially what I would plan to do, since I would not have a mailbox at my address, so I would bring in my property deed and satellite photos and then show them that this is the street address, that it would be that street address if I had a mailbox there. And that's what I would do. So here it is right here. In the statute, it says change your permanent domicile on your then you have 30 days to apply for a duplicate driver's license. So again, the statute is actually your permanent domicile, not your permanent street address, which is that's different than your domicile. But they're assuming that that's your street address for your license. So that's a subtle difference, but it's an important legal difference. So the domicile is defined by the state jurisdiction, and that makes sense since it's a driver's license. It's a state jurisdiction. So your permanent mailing address and your residence address is it says here, if you where you reside within 30 days after the application. But again, that doesn't mean you have to change it every 30 days you move. It just means that that's your permanent domicile. So in other words, if you're not changing to a permanent domicile, then you should not have to change your mailing address. But the implication here is that wherever you move to, that's your permanent mailing address. This is why like students do not have to change their driver's license address. But some DMV workers might insist that a student does change their DMV address, and I'll get to that example. Now And why would they do that? Because if you're living as a student at a place at the same address for more than 6 months, then the person at the DMV might say, well, that's your new permanent address. In other words, it's permanent address, but you haven't changed your domicile. See, that's again the difference between a permanent residence versus a permanent domicile. So it's a very subtle difference that a DMV worker is not going to understand, most likely. So the question is then, can you have a campsite that would be your permanent domicile? So you might, again, if you're not getting a real ID driver's license, you might be able to use the street address of the post office box as your new residential address, but they're probably going to have something in their system that would not allow that. So okay, so then we get into how do you define domicile. For Minnesota, they have a list of 26 factors that you use to define your domicile. And so the whole point of a permanent address change is where you get your legal mail. So they want to be able to find you if you need to be summoned for court, that kind of thing. So if you get pulled over by the cops, now what the cops will do is if you have no permanent address, if you don't have any kind of street address, the police will write you down as transient in their file, their database. Now what's interesting about that is that a transient is not somebody who has domicile. So if you still have domicile, because the statute says you're changing permanent domicile, so technically you are not a transient if you have permanent domicile. So the police should not be putting transient in the database just because you don't have a street the correct street address on your driver's license, because you could still be have permanent domicile in the state without being a transient. So what does that mean? Okay, I already went into this, like the second change of address has to begin in the second 6-day month, so that's a permanent. So that's the difference between a permanent address change and so to have a permanent domicile, it's where you vote, it's where you do your tax returns. Now you can have tax returns but not necessarily have a street address, because you could have property that doesn't have a street address but still requires you to pay property tax. And so you own property and you pay taxes, so you have tax. A tax return would be your income tax. Okay, so that's interesting, because income tax does require a street address to file a tax return. Okay, so now let's see here. So that's something I need to look into, whether you could use your file your tax return from a virtual mailing address. Let me just search that real quick. No, you cannot. You can use it to file business taxes, but not individual taxes. So Individuals with income derived from farm income. Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, so right there, if I file farm my farm income as a LLC, then it would be a business that I could use the virtual um, address to file for the business. Uh, that's very interesting. Okay, so that answers that question right there. Self-employed farmers. Okay, LLC. Okay, so that explains that. All right, I'm glad I'm making this video because I just it's forcing me to review my research. Okay, so basically the domicile is you have to file again a statement with the tax. You have to revoke your old domicile in order to create a new domicile. And so so here we have the county saying that you can't, if you rent a campsite, you cannot use it for any permanent residency, and so you have to remove your camper from that site for 6 months of the year, which is kind of interesting. And so the domicile is legally, it's supposed to be where you can enjoy privacy and keep your belongings safe. So hopefully you can do that. Whereas a residency, you're just physically there in a place, but a domicile is your intent to make it your permanent home. So the domicile is where you have an abode, but you don't necessarily physically occupy the abode, the dwelling. And let's see. And so usually they consider you to be a resident if you have domicile status. In other words, the domicile status makes you a resident. But you can be a resident at an address on a temporary business basis, even though you have domicile for the state as a permanent domicile. So then we've talked about a bank account, and then you get into your car insurance. So for car insurance, you're supposed to have the same zip code where you have the car parked, and you'll find this even on your vehicle registration renewal. They'll say what county is your car parked in. Now for your insurance, that's the same. That's not the same as county. It's more specific because you can have a very close zip code that's slightly different and then get charged a different insurance rate. But as far as the county, they want to know that you're not having a different residence than your mailing address for your county. In other words, you want your mailing address to be in the same county as your residential address for the driver's license. Okay, so again, you have to use a street address, but for residency, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a mailbox at that street address. And I already gave the example before. So here's somebody who has a post office box number, and therefore they can't get their bank account, even though it's a forwarding It's because again it's a forwarding address, and so the banking system they they flag these forwarding services as not being your actual permanent residence. Um, Now some say, well, they're if they use Bank of America, then that's fine. They can have a virtual mailing address, and so um, it depends on the bank. Like again, technically, if you have a commercial business address, that should be fine under the FINRA regulations. So it's going to be up to the discretion of the particular banker. So here you have a question of, well, can you camp on your land if you don't have a permit? So once you pull a permit, building permit, then any other structure on the land is going to have to be assessed as property, because they ask you what other structures do you have on the land, and so you couldn't live in any other structure on the land, but you could still camp out there. And that's why people will live in their trailers while they're after they pulled a permit. And also, you can, depending on what your county code is, you can have your accessory building before your main dwelling. So you could pull like a garage permit in my county if you wanted to, or a shed permit, and then they would, of course, they'd still check up on you, but you get a street address then for your land if you wanted to, and then you're supposed to complete the permit in 1 year. But if you don't pull another building permit, then technically you could be camping out on your land and probably like living in your shed if you want, or using the shed at least for storage as residential use of the structure. It, you could be doing that for years until you actually pull the building permit for the dwelling. So that somebody said they did. That's exactly what they did. They pulled in their camping trailer, and they lived in the trailer for a year and just said it was their construction trailer until they were building their actual house. So depending on your county code, again, here's somebody who lived in their RV. So they had an address because they got a like a garage permit as a carport, and then again they just didn't pull their dwelling permit yet. So that's a possibility, you could do that. But again, the question is, if you want a campsite where you have privacy and you don't have a actual street address. So again, you can use the satellite maps and your property deed to establish your street address, even though you don't get mail there. And this is my point. Okay, so here we have again some of the post office. The post office says, well, if you use the street address of the post office, then that should be allowed, as your permanent mailing address. But that that's going to depend on the DMV worker, and there's only certain post offices that allow you to use your street address, and you have to pay a little extra for that to use their street address. And there's a name for that service. Okay, so here's somebody again who says they lived in a boat. They lived in a boat, and they said for your driver's license, you can literally just write down the cross streets because that's your physical residential address, even though there's no mailing street number for a mailbox. So again, that's another example where they're proving that your permanent address is your legal address, but not necessarily there's not necessarily a mailbox there. And then you can have another address where you receive your mail. So that's what I would do. That would be my plan to do. And so here somebody's pointing out that on your driver's license you can use any residential address. As long as it's a residential address. But again, like if you're getting insurance, well, that would get you in trouble if it's not your actual address where you're, getting insurance. Okay, so just getting into some of this. So yeah, and also if you get pulled over by the cops and they say, "Well, is this your current address?" Then you're gonna get in trouble if it's on your driver's license. It's not actually where you live. But if you're using your actual residence where you live, even though you don't get mail there, then the street address will be where you actually live, and that's what law enforcement wants to know is where can they find you if they're trying to track you down. Okay. So here's an example where people point out that people getting insurance are putting their country cabin or their cottage as their car insurance address, and this is exactly why the vehicle renewal asks you what county do you park your car in, because the insurance rate is actually increasing out in this rural town because people are lying on their insurance and claiming that their cabin address is where their car is always parked. Okay, so again, people say, well, you can use a virtual street address for your car insurance. Well, that depends. It depends on if it's the same address that's on your driver's license. Then yes, you could probably get away with it. You could probably use that. But again, if you do have any sort of claim on your insurance and that's not actually where you park your car all the time, then that could cause a serious problem. Okay, so here we go. That the permanent domicile relies on what's called the continuing domicile presumption, which again means that even if you change your residency to your car and that's where you live permanently, if you're driving around in other states, that does not change your domicile of where the state you originated from. Let's see. And so here we have the crucial point of this whole video is that a fixed permanent domicile does not necessarily mean a real property connection to a state. And by a state meaning it's not a permanent residence, as in a street address as your primary residence. but it does mean more than a transient connection. So in other words, just because you don't have a mailing street address with a mailbox, that doesn't mean it's not your permanent abode or your permanent domicile, because you can still have more than a transient connection. Again, if you determine domicile, it's like, if do you vote there, do you pay taxes, do you file taxes, do you own property? Okay, so um, so again, that would imply that you can use your legal street address even though you don't get um, mail there. And here they're saying, well, you probably could use the street address of your post office box, but it's whether the DMV database would flag that or not. I don't know, because if you're not getting a real ID, they might not flag it. But again, this would be like if the police stop you and they say, "Is this where you currently live?" Then obviously that's going to be a problem. You can't use even a street address for legal documents. So it'd be technically it's against the law. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Um, so technically, you could, if you haven't changed your permanent mailing address. In other words, if you're not going to live at a place for more than 6 months, then you could technically still use your previous mailing address, and then just have a different mailing address to receive the driver's license. And you could do that the same for insurance, but again, it's going to be a problem on your insurance because that's not where your car is parked anymore, and it's not your garaging zip code. So this is where you want to have your use a street address even though you don't get mail there. So to see whether an address is real or not, it's going to come up in the post office database as an address that's usable. So here's somebody who says that they just change their forwarding address every 12 months. So they'll use any residential address, even though they don't live there. And then they use a P.O. box to get their driver's license and their insurance. And then they'll use their parents' address for their proof of residency to get the P.O. box. And then every year they'll change their residential address. and then they'll change their PO box because it's a new year. You have to change. You have to renew your PO box every year. So essentially, they're getting their mail sent to a temporary address, and then they're just hiding their actual legal permanent address by continually having a new temporary address. Um, Here's somebody who just did not change their permanent mailing address, even though they've moved like 20 times. So as long as your driver's license and your insurance address are the same, then it's probably not going to be a problem. So here's somebody again who used the post office street address as their permanent address. Um, and then they hide it. They hide it with if they get pulled over by the police, then they already have their street address filed with the insurance company, so that the police don't check to see that the insurance address is the same as your driver's license address. Obviously, like that would be assuming your driver's license address is going to be something different than a post office street address. So, in other words, you could keep your previous driver's license address and then just change your insurance address to the post office box that you're using. So that's kind of interesting option. Whether the insurance company would allow that, it's somebody had a problem where their insurance company did not allow that because their driver's license address was different than their insurance address. So it got flagged by the insurance company. So again, the money laundering federal regulation actually allows for a business street address for an individual. So that's very interesting. Okay, so what this is telling me is that I'm going to renew my LLC so I could file my farm taxes as my LLC for my permanent domicile status, and therefore not be required to have a mailing at a post office mailbox, or I mean a mailbox on my residence address. Okay, so here's people they're trying to prove their residence address by using a lease. They just create their own lease. So the DMV would flag the commercial personal mailbox address. So you wouldn't be able to have that on your driver's license. So that's the whole key point. Is that you could have I'm just trying to say you can have your legal street address on your driver's license, even though you don't get your mail there. But in order to file taxes, you'd have to file taxes as a business in order to use a personal mailbox street address. If you don't have a residential address where you get your mail. Okay. Let me see. Let me just double check. Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, so you can use a PO box to file your personal taxes if you don't get if your post office doesn't deliver mail to your home. Does that mean if you do not have a home address for them to send it to and use your old address, you can either use your PO box. Okay, so I guess you can file taxes from your PO box. You must include a mailing address on your tax return. So you can file it from a PO box. Yeah. Okay. Sweet. Okay. Nice. All right. So I don't have to file the LLC. Do not have to file the LLC. That's good because they track your LLCs now. If you file an LLC. So this is all the county stuff. Okay, so here, this also gets into the Driver's Privacy Protection Act, which says that the state DMV cannot have access to your, they cannot have access to your personal residential address. So they're using your mailing address, so they can't release that your personal residential address, and that's why they give you the option of using a temporary mailing address that's different than your permanent residential address. Okay. So it does affect your credit score if you're using a PO box address, even if it's a street address. So I would get a virtual mailing street address, which is a commercial street address. Alrighty. So they also have this legal street address database, but that's again based on your mailbox, which would be what you file with the county as a legal street address. So that's kind of interesting. That's based on what a residence would be as a permanent dwelling or a seasonal dwelling. Once you file for a residential dwelling permit, then you get this legal street address with the mailbox. But again, that's not the same as having a street address based on your owning property. Okay. So, for example, my state does not use that database, at least not in the public domain. Okay, so that's pretty much all she wrote. Complicated, boring, but necessary.